A celebration turned into a reckoning, and silence became the loudest sound in America. Washington woke up to war. Not with weapons, but with words. In a single morning, Vice President J.D. Vance dismantled decades of political theater, turning Senator Chuck Schumer's victory speech into his own public reckoning. What began as a celebration of Zoran Mamdani's shocking win in New York exploded into a national debate. Schumer's declaration that Trump's time is up was supposed to be a victory lap. Instead, it triggered a response that ripped through the foundations of his own party. Vance didn't yell. He didn't tweet a storm. He wrote 12 words. A Soros-funded scam bankrupted New York while we cut costs for workers. And in less than an hour, those 12 words reshaped the balance of American power. This video uncovers how that single sentence flipped the script on Washington. How Vance's defiance shattered the Democratic machine. How Schumer's silence became his downfall. Stay until the end, because the answer to why this moment matters isn't found in the noise of politics. It's in the silence that followed. Before we dive in, drop a comment where you're watching from and hit subscribe so you never miss this moment. It started with 12 words. A single post on Truth Social that detonated through Washington like a coded missile. A Soros-funded scam bankrupted New York while we cut costs for workers. The timestamp read 6:42 a.m. J.D. Vance hadn't been seen in public since the New York election the night before. The one Schumer had called the rebirth of American progress. Cameras caught Schumer's grin, the champagne spray, the sound bite he'd rehearsed for weeks. President Trump's time is up. But when Vance's post hit, the mood in D.C. changed instantly. Phones buzzed, aides cursed under their breath, and by the third minute, the headline had overtaken every feed in the Capitol. Networks scrambled to verify it. Cable anchors froze mid-sentence. For once, no one seemed to know what the vice president meant. Inside the West Wing, his staff didn't either. They were used to strategy. Deliberate, disciplined messaging. Every syllable tested. This wasn't that. This was precision chaos. Yet it grew. Two things were clear. Schumer's team had gone silent, and the Democrats' morning victory tour was over before breakfast on cable. Producers described the post as a declaration of war in plain text. But Vance hadn't raised his voice or called for outrage. He'd done something rarer. He'd shifted the narrative without a sound. For decades, the Democratic establishment had built itself on controlling the rhythm of outrage. Mastering when to panic, when to celebrate, when to pivot. But Vance had discovered a quieter weapon: timing. As the sun rose over the Capitol dome, the first wave of reactions hit social media. Blue-check journalists mocked him, calling it Trumpism with better grammar. But beneath the surface, working-class forums, union groups, and small business pages were erupting with a different energy entirely. A retired steelworker in Ohio reposted it with the caption, "He's right, they broke us." A deli owner in Queens added, "We didn't go bankrupt, the city did." By 8:20 a.m., Vance's team had analytics no campaign manager in history had ever seen. An 84% positive sentiment spike across independent voters, all driven by one sentence. In New York, Schumer's staff locked themselves in a conference room on the 5th floor of the DNC headquarters. "Don't respond," one aide whispered. "It'll die in a day." But it didn't die. It evolved. On cable news, the split screen told the story. Schumer smiling, glass in hand, and beside him, a screenshot of Vance's post, glowing in white text on a dark background. To the untrained eye, it was politics as usual. But inside the White House, something else was brewing. Vance had gone silent again. No follow-ups, no clarifications, just stillness. That silence was strategic, because while the nation obsessed over the post, Vance was already writing something else. A speech that would within hours turn the story from a scandal into a reckoning. And when he stepped in front of the cameras that morning, America wouldn't just hear from a vice president. They'd hear from a man who had learned to weaponize truth itself. The ballroom at the Roosevelt Hotel glowed gold that night. An ocean of crystal glasses, flash bulbs, and blue banners stretched against marble columns. Reporters filled every corner, feeding on the euphoria that comes with victory. Chuck Schumer stood at the podium, half a smile frozen on his face. He was breathing victory like oxygen. Behind him, the screen flashed. Zoran Mamdani, mayor-elect, New York City. A cheer thundered through the hall. This, Schumer declared, tapping the podium for rhythm, is what democracy looks like when decency wins. The cameras loved him. He was the seasoned general reclaiming moral ground after 4 bruising years of populist insurgency. Beside him, Mamdani raised his fist, the image that would headline every morning paper. In the front row, a staffer leaned toward another. He's really going for it, wouldn't you? The vice president's cornered. Not for long, the other whispered, but no one heard that. The room was too loud. The speech stretched beyond what anyone expected. Schumer moved from victory to vindication. From policy to prophecy. New York is proof, he said, that Americans have rejected fear. They've rejected division. They've rejected J.D. Vance's politics of resentment. The audience roared. Champagne corks burst. Somewhere near the back, a CNN producer whispered into his headset. Get that quote. Isolated. Top of the hour. It was a celebration, but beneath it, a subtle arrogance hummed through the air. The kind that only exists in moments when people believe the fight is over. At 10:47 p.m., as the band began to play and cameras panned across dancing donors, Mamdani approached Schumer. You think he'll respond? He asked. Half joking, Schumer smiled, teeth glinting in the light. Vance, he doesn't know how to play long games. He'll tweet something angry and look small. It's what populists do. The crowd around them laughed. It was the sound of people who thought they'd already won the next election. But across the river, in a quiet Georgetown townhouse, J.D. Vance sat alone at his desk. The light from his monitor cast sharp shadows on his face. He had watched Schumer's speech twice. Once live, once muted. The second viewing was the one that mattered. He noticed the smirk at the mention of working families. The way the applause dipped when Schumer said, "Unity." The split second of uncertainty in Mamdani's eyes. Tiny fractures that no one else saw. But Vance did. His chief of staff entered quietly. They're calling it the Schumer Doctrine. He thinks this locks 2026. Vance didn't look up. It locks something. All right. A pause. What do you want to do? He finally turned from the screen. His tone was calm, surgical, nothing loud, just one truth. He typed it out himself. No consultants, no drafts. No revisions. When he hit post, the silence in the room was total. The staffer frowned. That's it. Vance stood, straightened his tie, and said, that's all it takes when they've been lying this long. The staffer didn't respond. He didn't need to. Everyone in that house knew what the sentence meant, and what it would unleash by morning. As the lights of Manhattan shimmered across the Hudson, Schumer's celebration continued, oblivious to the quiet storm forming on the other side. History had already shifted, and none of them had noticed. At 1000 a.m., the White House press room looked like a war zone dressed in suits. Every seat was taken, every hand gripped a phone. No one knew exactly what J.D. Vance was going to say. But everyone knew it would matter. The vice president entered without fanfare. No teleprompter, no notes, just a folder in his hand and a look that said he'd already made peace with whatever came next. Good morning. He began, his voice steady. I wasn't going to speak today. But when someone tells the American people they've rejected fear, while their own city is bankrupt, I think the truth deserves a little airtime. The room fell still. Even the clicking of cameras paused for half a breath. He didn't smile. He didn't posture. He simply told a story. Yesterday, Senator Schumer said, New York is proof that decency wins. I agree. Decency should win. But tell that to the families whose small businesses were taxed out of existence. Tell that to the cops who can't afford to live in the city they protect. Tell that to the single mother in Queens who's watching her rent triple while her mayor celebrates progress. Reporters leaned forward. The rhythm was deliberate, calm, precise, like a surgeon with a steady hand and a sharp blade. This isn't about left or right, he continued. It's about truth versus corruption. Because when they tell you New York is thriving, they're not talking about you. They're talking about themselves. He paused, eyes scanning the crowd. Cameras caught the silence perfectly. The kind of pause that forces people to lean closer. For years, he said softly, they've told working Americans that their struggles were necessary sacrifices. That elites knew best. That failure was the cost of progress. But here's the truth. They didn't fail with you. They failed on purpose. Gasps rippled through the room. The phrasing was surgical accusation framed as revelation. And here's what's different now. Vance said, lowering his voice. We're not waiting for permission to speak anymore. We're not asking for validation from people who sold their integrity to billionaires and called it democracy. We're building something honest, something earned. He stepped closer to the podium, his voice turning almost intimate. Every time you hear them say, I'm angry, remember this. I'm calm. I'm calm because the truth doesn't need to shout. Reporters were frozen. They didn't know whether to applaud or attack. It was that rare kind of speech. Too sharp to ignore, too disciplined to dismantle. When it ended, Vance didn't linger. He simply closed the folder, nodded once, and walked off stage. For a full 7 seconds, the room stayed silent. Then chaos erupted. Shouting, phones buzzing, news desks calling in live reactions. Across town, Schumer's office was in meltdown. Staffers argued over whether to respond or stay silent. One aide slammed his phone down. He just called us corrupt on live TV and sounded like a priest doing it. Another shook her head. It's worse than that. He sounded honest. Within an hour, the clip was everywhere. Millions of views trending on every platform. Cable anchors replayed it, searching for weakness, but there was none. The speech wasn't loud. It was clean, and that made it unstoppable. By sunset, Schumer's celebration was no longer the story. J.D. Vance's truth was. By 11:30 a.m., the celebration room at the Roosevelt looked like a crime scene of optimism. Streamers hung limp. Empty glasses cluttered the tables. The blue banners from the night before were still up, but no one dared look at them. In a private suite upstairs, Schumer's inner circle gathered around a wide glass table. 10 people. All silence. Close the curtains, Schumer said quietly. The blinds rattled shut, blocking out the reporters still camped outside. He turned to his communications director. How bad is it? She hesitated. Sir, we're at a 5-alarm situation. Donor lines are jammed. Wall Street's calling for statements. They want reassurance. Then reassure them. I've tried. They've seen the numbers. Schumer's jaw tightened. Which numbers? The ones from Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and New York. The approval shift. It's real. His speech hit the union base hard. They think he's the only one telling the truth. Someone else spoke up. A veteran pollster with half a lifetime in campaign trenches. Senator, the problem isn't the speech. It's the tone. He didn't yell. He sounded like he meant it. The room buzzed with that sentence. He sounded like he meant it. That's what terrified them most. On the far end of the table, Mamdani sat, hands clasped. The new mayor looked smaller under the fluorescent light. Maybe we issue a counterstatement, he offered. Focus on results. Housing, transit, education. Bring it back to policy. Schumer shook his head. Policy doesn't trend. Emotion does. So hit back emotionally. Mamdani said. Say he's fear-mongering. The pollster cut in. Fear-mongering only works if people feel safe. Right now they don't. For the first time, Schumer looked uncertain. He rubbed his temple, voice low. You're saying we have no counter? I'm saying he made himself the reasonable man in the room. The pollster replied. That's never happened before. A long silence settled. The sound of air conditioning filled the void. Finally, Schumer spoke again. What are the networks doing? Replaying it, the comms director said flatly. Every 15 minutes. Even MSNBC is calling it a moment of clarity. He exhaled slowly. All right, then we wait. He'll overplay it. They always do. But even as he said it, the room knew it wasn't true. Down the hall, an aide whispered into her phone. The senator's holding, but donors are panicking. Some already froze contributions. The phrase froze contributions carried more weight than any headline. In Washington, that was code for bleeding out. Back in the suite, Schumer stood and faced the window. He didn't open the blinds. He just stared at the faint light filtering through. This isn't about one post, he muttered. He's trying to brand the entire party as dishonest. Mamdani spoke softly. And it's working. Schumer turned sharply. Not yet. Not until I say it is. But the words lacked conviction. In that moment, everyone in the room understood something they couldn't say out loud. That the country had shifted overnight. And the man who'd caused it hadn't raised his voice once. By the next morning, Capitol Hill felt different. Not louder. Quieter. The kind of silence that signals something underneath the surface is starting to move. Everywhere you turned, screens were replaying the same 30 seconds. Vance at the podium, steady gaze, calm voice. That line, the truth doesn't need to shout. Even in private offices, staffers watched it like a scene from a movie they couldn't stop rewinding. On the third floor of the Hart building, a senior Democratic aide shut her laptop and whispered, "He didn't sound like a politician." Her colleague nodded. "That's the problem. People don't trust politicians right now. They trust him." Across the hall, a moderate senator from Minnesota paced behind closed doors. He just reframed the entire populist argument. He told his chief of staff. He made anti-corruption sound bipartisan. Should we counter it? Counter truth? You can't. Meanwhile, in the Republican cloakroom, the mood was a mix of awe and disbelief. One congressman muttered, "Trump yells. Vance whispers. And people listen. That's new." Another replied, "He's not just speaking to conservatives. He's recruiting the middle." Even among those who disliked him, there was reluctant respect. They'd all seen politicians try to go viral. Vance hadn't tried. He just said something real. And the country moved. By noon, op-eds began appearing under cautious headlines. The Vance phenomenon, a return to authentic politics. Schumer's silence, strategic or fatal. Cable networks filled panels with analysts pretending to have seen it coming. But the truth was simpler. No one had. In a downtown restaurant, 3 lobbyists met for lunch, each pretending not to look over their shoulders. "Schumer's donors are calling us." One said, "They're nervous." "They should be." Another replied, "If he can turn working-class voters in New York, he can flip the Rust Belt overnight." The third leaned in. "He's redefining populism. It's not angry anymore. It's rational." That's scarier than Trump ever was. Back in the White House, Vance was sitting in the Situation Room. Not for a briefing, but for silence. He stared at the national polling updates flashing across the screen. +8 in independents, +5 in swing states. Approval soaring in demographics no Republican had touched in decades. An aide spoke quietly. "Sir, we're being told not to comment further. Let the dust settle." Vance didn't respond. He watched the screen a moment longer. Then said, "Dust is where truth disappears. Keep the air moving." The aide didn't ask what that meant. He just nodded. By evening, the echo had reached even Schumer's closest allies. Phone calls went unanswered. Donor dinners were postponed. The senator who had declared victory 48 hours earlier was now avoiding cameras altogether. And in the streets of Queens, in diners across Ohio, in living rooms in Michigan, people were talking not about Schumer, not about Mamdani. They were talking about the man who'd said what everyone else was too afraid to. That corruption wasn't a party problem. It was an American one. That realization, quiet, slow, and contagious, was the sound of power beginning to shift hands. The leak didn't come from an intern. It never does. It came from someone who'd been in politics long enough to know where to place a knife. So it cuts without leaving fingerprints. At 8:12 a.m., Politico broke the story. Internal DNC memo warns of severe credibility collapse among working-class voters. 3 pages. Anonymous source. Dated less than 24 hours ago. Inside Schumer's office, panic hit before the coffee cooled. Who the hell leaked it? One aide snapped. Schumer didn't answer. He was staring at the printout in front of him, his reading glasses sliding down his nose. The memo's language was brutal. Voters perceived J.D. Vance as authentic. Party messaging on economic integrity no longer resonates. Recommend full review of donor transparency policies before midterms. He read it twice, then said quietly, "Someone in this building wrote this." No one spoke. The room was thick with the kind of silence that comes before resignation. "Get me communications," Schumer said finally. "They've been calling all morning." His chief of staff replied, "Everyone wants a quote. They say silence looks like surrender." Schumer's eyes hardened. Silence isn't surrender. It's strategy. But even as he said it, the phones kept ringing. The story was spreading faster than damage control could keep up. Across the city, cable anchors were dissecting every word of the memo. MSNBC called it a rare internal revolt. Fox called it confirmation of collapse. CNN tried to be diplomatic. The memo highlights a growing division within the Democratic establishment over messaging and trust. In reality, it was much simpler. The House was cracking. That afternoon, a group of younger Democratic senators held a private meeting at the Capitol. They didn't invite Schumer. A first-term senator from Michigan spoke first. "If we keep tying ourselves to the old guard, we're done. People don't want polished speeches anymore. They want honesty. And right now he's the only one giving it. Another senator, older, leaned back in his chair. You're saying we pivot toward Vance's message? I'm saying we stop pretending we're clean when everyone knows we're not. It wasn't rebellion yet, but it was close. By early evening, news broke that 2 high-profile donors had quietly suspended contributions pending restructuring of party strategy. That's how they phrased it. Restructuring in D.C. That meant they were waiting to see who survived the fallout. Back at the DNC headquarters, Schumer met with Mamdani. The young mayor looked uneasy. Less like a victor now. More like collateral. This isn't my fault, he said. My campaign was clean. Schumer's tone was sharp. It's not about clean. It's about optics. You're the face of a wind that's turning into a liability. So what? I disappear for now. Yes. Manny didn't argue. He just stood there, nodded once, and left without shaking hands. As the door shut, Schumer turned to his staff. You find out who leaked that memo. I don't care what it takes. But the truth was already out. Not just the document, but the deeper truth underneath it. That the party that once defined discipline was now defined by fear. And while Schumer fought ghosts inside his own house, J.D. Vance was preparing something else. Not a post, not a speech, a conversation, a televised town hall, the kind that could reach the very voters Schumer had just lost. The network called it a special edition. But everyone inside the studio knew what it really was. A test. Would J.D. Vance's message survive outside of the echo chamber of social media? Could calm conviction still command the room in real time? The studio lights burned wide across the stage. No podium, no teleprompter, just 2 chairs, a semicircle of voters, and cameras from every angle. Vice President Vance, the host said as the red light blinked on your recent comments. The nation seems more divided than ever. What do you say to critics who call your remarks inflammatory? Vance leaned back, hands folded loosely. I'd say they weren't listening. He replied, I didn't attack anyone. I asked a question. Who's really benefiting from the system we've built? Because it's not the people working double shifts just to stay afloat. The crowd murmured. Not applause. Agreement. The host pressed on. But your comments about corruption. I said corruption exists. Vance interrupted smoothly. And if that's controversial, that tells you more about Washington than it does about me. The audience laughed lightly. Not at the joke, but at the truth in it. Vance continued, his tone shifting from composed to personal. I grew up in a part of America that politicians forget exists until election season. Every 4 years, they show up with cameras, make promises, and vanish. I'm not here to promise. I'm here to ask, what went wrong with a system that rewards lying better than hard work? A woman in the audience raised her hand. You're saying both parties are to blame? Yes, he said, but only one side's willing to admit it. The host tried to pivot to policy. But Vance wouldn't take the bait. He wasn't there to debate. He was there to connect. I don't care what letter's next to someone's name, he said. I care whether they can look a welder from Toledo in the eye and explain why his taxes fund billion-dollar bailouts while his kids can't afford college. The camera panned to the audience. Heads nodding, arms folded. People listening in a way cable news hadn't seen in years. And then came the moment that would replay on every major network that night. A retired nurse stood up. Her voice trembled. I voted Democrat my whole life. But when you spoke about truth, it felt like you were talking to me. Not at me. Why does that feel so rare now? Vance paused. The silence stretched just long enough to feel sacred. Because, he said softly, truth stopped being profitable. But it's still powerful. The crowd erupted, not with cheers, but applause that sounded like release. The kind that comes from hearing what you already knew, but never thought anyone in power would say out loud. Backstage, Schumer's team watched in disbelief. This isn't a rally, one aide said. It's a conversion. Another muttered. He's rebuilding trust live on air. That's not supposed to be possible. By the end of the hour, the data was already rolling in. Engagement through the roof. Positive sentiment across party lines. Hashtags flooding every feed. Truth is patriotic. Vance Town Hall. Schumer silence once calculated now looked like retreat. And the trap Vance had set was complete. He turned political honesty into populist theater. And the establishment had no counterplay. By Thursday morning, Washington no longer felt like Washington. Hallways that usually buzzed with confidence now carried whispers instead. The energy had shifted, not outwardly, but in posture. People spoke softer, moved faster, checked over their shoulders before using words like loyalty. At the Democratic National Committee headquarters, the first donor cancellations hit like warning shots. Goldman paused its quarterly transfer. A Chicago real estate pact temporarily suspended political giving. Then came the email that froze every phone in the building. Effective immediately, the Hamilton Trust is reviewing its partnerships. The Hamilton Trust was Schumer's cornerstone, the financial artery of his influence. When that artery closed, every office in Washington felt it. In a private call with senior aides, Schumer tried to sound composed. "This is a reactionary phase," he said. Donors always flinch during media storms. But no one believed it. Not even him. The deputy finance director spoke softly, trying to keep her voice neutral. "Sir, they're not flinching. They're hedging." "Hedging what?" "Authenticity." He blinked. "What does that even mean?" She hesitated. "They think Vance has it. And we don't." The line went dead quiet. Across town, in a glass-walled office overlooking the PTOAC, two major fundraisers were having their own meeting. "He's not even fundraising," one said. "That's the point." The other replied, "People are offering him money. It's the sincerity premium." They both laughed, but it wasn't humor. It was disbelief. Meanwhile, inside the Senate, alliances began to shift like tectonic plates. A junior senator from Wisconsin refused to back Schumer's latest resolution, citing concerns about messaging alignment. It was a small move, but symbolic. The first public crack in party unity. By midday, a rumor began to circulate through the Capitol cafeteria that several senior Democrats were drafting a confidence letter. Not a resignation, but something worse, a call for new leadership, better attuned to the national mood. Schumer's chief of staff burst into his office holding a printed copy. Where did this come from? Anonymous. But the signatures are real. He scanned the list. Names he'd mentored, funded, protected. It read like a betrayal written in polite language. "Get them in here," Schumer said, voice low. "Every one of them. They won't come, sir. They're meeting at the Hay Adams." That was the final insult. Plotting revolution across the street from the White House in plain view of his window. At that exact hour, Vance was sitting in his office with his communications team. He didn't gloat, didn't even smile. He was reviewing letters from citizens, truckers, teachers, veterans, thanking him for telling the truth. "This isn't political," he said quietly. "It's moral. People are starved for honesty." One aide nodded. "They say it feels like you're giving them permission to believe again." Vance closed the folder. "Good, because belief's the one thing they can't buy back once it's gone." By evening, networks were running new polls. Vance's approval among independents had surged to 68%. Schumer's had fallen to 29%. Cable pundits called it a realignment. But it was more than that. It was an inversion, the powerful becoming fragile, the underestimated becoming inevitable. In the quiet of his office, Schumer sat alone, staring at his reflection in the window. Washington behind him, his own empire flickering in the glass. He whispered to no one in particular. They don't want leadership anymore. They want confession. And for the first time in his career, he realized he had nothing left to confess that anyone would believe. The Capitol was nearly empty when J.D. Vance walked into room 216. No cameras, no aides, just one security guard at the far end of the hall pretending not to listen. Schumer was already there sitting at the long mahogany table. No papers, no glass of water, just his hands clasped in front of him. The same hands that had signed more bills, raised more funds, and shaped more policy than most living politicians combined. He looked up as Vance entered. "You came?" Vance nodded. "You asked." The door closed behind them with a soft click. Silence. Schumer spoke first. "You realize what you've done?" "I told the truth," Vance said simply. "No," Schumer shot back. "You dismantled faith in an entire party. In government itself." Vance leaned forward, elbows on the table. "You built a system that collapses under honesty." "That's not my fault." Schumer stared at him for a long moment. The weight of decades pressed against his expression. "You think this is about corruption? It's about chaos. You're feeding a country that doesn't understand how fragile this machine really is." Vance's voice was calm, deliberate. "It's only fragile when it depends on lies to run." Schumer rose from his seat. pacing slowly. You think you're different from Trump? You're just quieter about it. You build faith to wield it. That's still manipulation. Maybe, Vance replied, but at least I'm not selling it. Schumer froze mid-step. The words hung heavy between them. You've made a religion out of resentment. Schumer said finally. No, Vance answered. You did. I just stopped apologizing for it. The air shifted. Not loud, not violent, just sharp. The sound of something fundamental being said aloud for the first time. For a long while, neither man spoke. Outside, the hum of the Capitol's ventilation was the only sound. Then Schumer asked quietly, why now? You could have played it safe. Waited, taken the easy road to the presidency in 4 years. Why throw a grenade at the system that feeds you? Vance looked him in the eye. Because I grew up watching men like you say one thing on camera and another behind closed doors. And every lie you called strategy made someone else's life harder. You said America was built on compromise. But it was built on truth and it's starving for it. Schumer's jaw clenched. You think truth alone holds a country together? No, Vance said, but it's the only thing that can rebuild one. Silence again. For the first time, Schumer looked tired. Not angry, not defeated, just human. You know what happens next. He said quietly. They'll turn on you, too. Vance nodded. They already are. But at least they'll know I meant it. Schumer gave a faint smile. You really believe that's enough? I believe it's the only thing that ever was. The clock on the wall ticked once. Loud, mechanical, final. Schumer straightened his jacket. Then I suppose we both made history in different directions. Vance rose. History doesn't care about directions. It cares about who told the truth first. He turned toward the door. Hand on the handle. Schumer's voice stopped him one last time. You're not as calm as you look. Are you? Vance paused. No, he said. Just certain. Then he walked out, leaving Schumer alone in the chamber. Surrounded by the echoes of power and the quiet realization that truth had finally walked out the door. Dawn broke over Washington with an eerie calm. No press conferences. No motorcades. Just the low hum of a city pretending not to know it had changed forever. 3 days had passed since the closed-door meeting. Schumer hadn't been seen in public. His office released a one-line statement. The senator is taking time to reflect and consult with colleagues. In D.C. language that meant retreat across the PTOAC in a small Ohio diner. The television above the counter played a rerun of Vance's town hall. No sound, just subtitles. A waitress refilled a cup of coffee and said, "He doesn't talk like them." The man at the counter nodded. That's why they hate him. In New York, the glow from City Hall had dimmed. Mamdani's team struggled to explain budget shortfalls. Donors backed away and protesters gathered not with chants, but questions. Where's the money? Who's lying? It wasn't outrage anymore. It was disillusionment turned analytical. Vance hadn't just won the argument. He'd shifted the country's attention from emotion to inquiry. Cable news, desperate to stay relevant, called it the Vance effect. A populist awakening wrapped in the language of reason. Analysts debated whether it was sustainable. Pundits tried to trademark it. And consultants scrambled to mimic it. But none of them understood the truth. It wasn't strategy. It was sincerity. Schumer watched it all from his brownstone window. He looked smaller now. Not weaker. Just aware. He had spent a lifetime mastering perception only to lose to a man who mastered silence. For the first time, he realized what every empire eventually learns. That power isn't lost in defeat. It erodes in disbelief. Meanwhile, Vance was back on the road. No grand tours. No rallies. Just quiet visits. Factories. Truck stops. Community halls. Reporters followed him, expecting spectacle, but found something stranger. Listening. He asked questions, took notes, shook hands without cameras rolling. Each stop felt less like campaigning and more like confession, the kind that belonged to both speaker and listener. By the time he returned to Washington, polls had stabilized. The chaos had cooled into something deeper. Trust not universal, not blind, just earned. That night, standing on the steps of the Capitol, Vance looked out over the city. The air was sharp and still. He wasn't smiling. But his eyes held the kind of calm that comes only from surviving the truth. A reporter shouted from below, "Mr. Vice President, what happens now?" He answered without a microphone. "Now," he said, "we rebuild one honest word at a time." The cameras caught it. The nation replayed it. And as the lights of Washington flickered against the horizon, the message was clear. The age of noise had ended, and in its place a dangerous, beautiful,